My name is Mara, and I carry two lives within me now, though only one is acknowledged in this house of white columns and cruel whispers. The autumn of 1858 brought more than just golden leaves to the Whitmore plantation in Georgia. It brought the knowledge that my body was creating something precious, while my spirit withered under the weight of servitude. I remember the morning I first felt the stirring in my belly, standing in the grand nursery of the main house, my dark hands carefully cradling little Master Thomas against my chest. His tiny fingers grasped at the fabric of my worn cotton dress, as I hummed the old songs my mama used to sing to me before they sold her away when I was just 12. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then, that I was nourishing this white child with my body while carrying my own that might never know such tender care. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore entered the nursery that morning like a storm cloud, her silk skirts rustling against the polished wooden floors, her pale blue eyes, cold as Winter Creek water, swept over me with the same disdain she reserved for examining livestock. She was a woman of 35, with golden hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. The South had shaped women like her into porcelain figures, beautiful and brittle, trained to command with a glance and destroy with a word. Mara, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone white folks used when they wanted to remind you of your place. I've noticed you've been eating more at meals lately, growing quite rotund, aren't we? Her words weren't a question, they were an accusation. Wrapped in false politeness, I kept my eyes downcast, as was expected, watching little Thomas's peaceful face as he dozed against my shoulder. Yes, ma'am, I whispered, because what else could I say? That I was carrying life, that my body needed nourishment for two, that even enslaved women were still women, still mothers, still human. Well, that simply won't do, Mrs. Whitmore continued, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers that had never known a day's hard labor. This household operates on discipline and order, not on the gluttony of help who think they can eat us out of house and home. From tomorrow, your portions will be reduced by half. Perhaps some hunger will remind you of your proper place and size. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't let it show. In the slave quarters, we learned early that showing pain only invited more. I nodded silently, my free hand instinctively moving to my still small belly, where my child was growing, unaware of the world that awaited them, unaware that their first lesson in this life would be hunger. That evening, as the sun painted the Georgia sky in shades of crimson and gold, I sat on the wooden steps of my small cabin, sharing the space with 3 other women who worked the house. The quarters were a row of simple structures, each barely large enough for sleeping and storing our meager possessions. But they were ours in the few hours between sunset and dawn. Sarah, an older woman whose hands told stories of 30 years picking cotton and tending white children, sat beside me mending a torn apron by the light of a small oil lamp. Her dark skin bore the lines of countless sorrows, but her eyes still held kindness. Child, she said softly, I see that burden you carrying, both the one in your belly and the one on your heart. I looked at her with surprise. I thought I'd hidden it well. But Sarah had delivered half the babies in the quarters over the years. She knew the signs better than any doctor. How long you known? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. About 2 weeks now, she replied, her needle catching the lamplight as she worked. The way you've been holding yourself, the way you touch your stomach when you think nobody's looking, and now with the mistress cutting your food. She shook her head sadly. That woman got ice water in her veins where most folks got blood. The other women gathered closer, their work forgotten, as we spoke in the hushed tones reserved for dangerous truths. There was Clara, barely 18, and still new to the harsh realities of plantation life, and old Betsy, whose weathered hands had caught more babies than she could count. In the quarters, we were family by necessity, bound together by shared suffering and small joys. You got to eat for that baby, Betsy said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many children lost to hunger and neglect. I don't care what that white woman say. A growing child need nourishment. We'll share what we can. The generosity of women, who had so little to give, overwhelmed me. These women, who received the same meager rations I did, were willing to go hungrier so my child might have a chance. It was a kind of love that the big house would never understand. Love born not of blood but of shared humanity in the face of inhumanity. As the weeks passed, my body began to change in ways that couldn't be hidden. My dresses, already simple and worn, grew tight across my expanding middle. Mrs. Whitmore's disapproval grew more pointed with each passing day. She would make comments about my condition in front of the other house staff, as if my pregnancy was a personal affront to her ordered world. "Really, Mara," she said one morning, as I carefully bathed little Thomas in his ornate nursery, "your situation is becoming quite unseemly. I hope you don't expect special treatment because of your circumstances. Slaves have been having babies for centuries without all this fuss." The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away, as if carrying life was somehow shameful, as if my child's existence was an inconvenience to her comfort. I continued washing the baby's tiny limbs with gentle hands, my own child moving restlessly in my womb, as if they could sense their mother's distress. But it was the hunger that became my constant companion. With my rations cut, and my body's needs growing daily, I felt a gnawing emptiness that went beyond physical discomfort. It was the hunger of desperation, the kind that makes you count every grain of rice and savor every drop of milk you're allowed to taste when feeding another woman's child. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I grew weaker, my milk production remained strong for little Thomas. My body was giving everything it had to nourish him, while my own child received only what little remained. It was a sacrifice I made not by choice but by force, a daily reminder of my place in this world where some lives mattered more than others. December brought a bitter cold to Georgia that seemed to seep into my very bones, and with it, a desperation I had never known before. My belly had grown round and prominent now, impossible to hide beneath my worn dresses, and with each passing day, the gnawing hunger became a living thing inside me, competing with my unborn child for the small space we shared. Mrs. Whitmore's cruelty had taken on new dimensions since my condition became obvious to everyone in the house. She would often call me to tend to little Thomas during mealtimes, ensuring I had to watch the family feast on roasted meats, fresh bread, and rich desserts while my own stomach cramped with emptiness. It was a deliberate torture, and we both knew it. "Mara," she would say with false sweetness, "do make sure Thomas gets plenty to eat. Growing children need proper nourishment, don't they?" The emphasis on her words was like a blade, cutting deep into my already wounded pride, reminding me that my child would never receive such care, such abundance. I had grown thin everywhere except my belly, my face gaunt and my hands trembling from weakness. When I looked at my reflection in the polished silver of the nursery mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. My dark skin had taken on an ashen quality, and my eyes held a hollow look that spoke of more than physical hunger. The other women in the quarters had begun to share more of their own meager portions with me, but it wasn't enough. We all knew it wasn't enough. Sarah would slip me extra cornbread when she could, and Clara would save bits of fat from the kitchen scraps. But their own bodies were suffering from the sacrifice. "This can't go on much longer," Sarah whispered to me one evening, as we sat by the dying embers of the fire in her cabin. Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen this tragedy play out before. "That baby needs you strong, and you fading away like morning mist." I knew she was right. I could feel my child's movements growing weaker, as if they too were succumbing to the hunger that consumed us both. There were nights when I would lie awake, my hands pressed to my belly, whispering apologies to the life growing within me, begging forgiveness for failing them before they even drew their first breath. It was during one of these dark nights that I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months before. I would ask Mrs. Whitmore directly for more food, not as a slave begging for scraps, but as one mother speaking to another. I knew the risks, knew that such boldness could result in punishment or worse, but desperation makes cowards of us all, or sometimes heroes. The next morning, I found her in the morning room, taking her breakfast of fresh eggs, thick bacon, and warm biscuits with honey. The smell alone was enough to make my empty stomach clench with longing. She was reading a letter from her sister in Savannah, her face serene in the golden morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up from her correspondence with irritation, clearly annoyed at being interrupted during her private time. "What is it, Mara? Can't you see I'm occupied?" I took a deep breath, feeling my child shift restlessly inside me. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you about my condition." The words came out more hesitant than I'd intended, but I pressed on. "The baby, ma'am. It needs more nourishment. I'm having trouble producing enough milk for little Thomas, and I'm worried." Her pale eyebrows rose in surprise, then quickly lowered into a frown. "Are you presuming to make demands of me, Mara? Are you forgetting your place in this household? No, ma'am, I replied quickly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. I'm just thinking of little Thomas. If I can't provide proper milk for him, he might suffer. I only want to serve your family better. It was a calculated risk, appealing to her concern for her son rather than begging for my own child's welfare. In this world, a white child's comfort would always trump a slave's survival, and I hoped that logic might penetrate her wall of indifference. Mrs. Whitmore set down her letter and studied me with those cold blue eyes. I could see her mind working, weighing the cost of feeding me against the potential loss of my services. Little Thomas had grown attached to me, and finding another wet nurse would be difficult and expensive. You're quite manipulative, aren't you, Mara? She said finally, her voice carrying a grudging respect mixed with disgust. Using my son's welfare to advance your own interests. How very clever of you. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I was using whatever leverage I had, even if it meant positioning my own child's needs as secondary to her son's comfort. It was a survival strategy born of desperation, the kind of moral compromise that slavery forced upon us daily. I served this family first, ma'am, I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the turmoil in my heart. Always have, always will. She returned to her breakfast, cutting her eggs with precise movements that suggested she was cutting through more than just food. Very well, she said without looking at me. You may have one additional biscuit each morning, but don't mistake this for charity. Mara, this is a business decision, nothing more, and if your performance suffers in any way, if Thomas shows even the slightest sign of neglect, this arrangement ends immediately. It wasn't much, one biscuit against the growing hunger of 2 lives, but it was something. I nodded gratefully, not trusting my voice to remain steady. If I tried to speak, as I turned to leave, she called out to me once more. And Mara, she said, her voice carrying a warning, don't think this changes anything between us. You are still property of this household, and your child will be as well. Best you remember that. The words followed me out of the room like a curse. A reminder that even this small victory came with chains attached. My child, not yet born, was already claimed by the system that owned us both, already destined for a life of servitude before they had drawn their first breath. That evening, as I shared the news with the other women in the quarters, their joy was tempered by the same realization that haunted me. Sarah hugged me close, her weathered hands gentle on my shoulders, but her eyes held sadness. One biscuit, she murmured. Lord help us all, one biscuit for 2 lives. But we celebrated what we could, because in a world where cruelty was the norm, even small mercies felt like miracles. Clara clapped her hands together softly, and old Betsy nodded with approval. You did good, child, she said. Sometimes we got to use whatever tools we given, even if they ain't pretty tools. As I lay down that night, my hand resting on my growing belly, I felt my child move more vigorously than they had in days. As if they somehow knew that tomorrow would bring slightly more nourishment, slightly more hope. I whispered to them in the darkness, telling them about the world they would enter, about the strength they would need, about the love that would surround them despite the hatred that shaped our days. March arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the coldness in the Whitmore household, and with it came changes that would test every assumption about power, privilege, and the bonds between mothers. My own child was due any day. Now, my body, heavy and uncomfortable, as I continued my duties caring for little Thomas, who had grown into a chubby, contented baby under my reluctant care. Mrs. Whitmore had been different lately, her usual sharp composure softened by her own approaching confinement. She was expecting her second child in late March, and the pregnancy had been difficult, leaving her pale and often confined to bed rest. Dr. Harrison, the family physician, visited twice weekly, his grave expressions and hushed conversations with Master Whitmore suggesting complications. It was during one of these visits that my own labor began, starting as gentle waves that gradually built into powerful contractions that threatened to bring me to my knees. I was in the nursery, rocking little Thomas to sleep, when the first real pain struck me like lightning. My hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair so tightly I thought the wood might crack. Sarah appeared at my side as if summoned by some invisible signal, her experienced eyes taking in my condition immediately. Come on, child, she whispered urgently. Time to bring this baby into the world. She carefully lifted Thomas from my arms and settled him in his crib before helping me to my feet. The walk to the slave quarters felt like miles, though it was only a few hundred yards. Each contraction bent me double, and Sarah's strong arm around my waist was the only thing keeping me upright. Other women emerged from their cabins as word spread, forming a protective circle around me. As nature took its ancient course, old Betsy had transformed my small cabin into a birthing room, with clean cloths and warm water prepared. Her hands, gnarled from decades of fieldwork, became gentle instruments of healing as she guided me through the process. My body knew instinctively the pain was beyond anything I had imagined, but it was pain with purpose, pain that promised new life. Push now, child, Betsy commanded during one particularly fierce contraction. Your baby ready to meet this world, ready or not. And then, in a rush of pain and relief that left me gasping, my daughter entered the world. Her cry was strong and clear, a sound that seemed to fill not just the small cabin but my entire being. With fierce joy, Betsy placed her on my chest, this perfect small person with dark skin, like mine, and tiny fists that grasped at the air as if already fighting for her place in the world. She beautiful, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Strong too, listen to them lungs. I named her Hope because in that moment, holding her warm body against mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a belief that tomorrow might be different from today, that this small person might know freedoms I never had. Even in the depths of slavery, hope could bloom like wildflowers in concrete. But my brief moment of pure joy was interrupted by Clara bursting into the cabin, her young face tight with panic. Mara, she gasped, you got to come, Mrs. Whitmore, she having her baby too, and something wrong. Real wrong, they asking for you specific. My blood ran cold. I had given birth less than 2 hours ago, my body still weak and bleeding, but the urgency in Clara's voice left no room for protest. Sarah helped me wrap Hope in a soft blanket while Betsy pressed clean cloths against me to stem the bleeding. I can't leave her, I whispered, looking down at my daughter's perfect face. She just born, she need me. Sarah, stay with her, Betsy said firmly, but you got to go. If that white woman die, they blame us all. You know how this works. With legs that shook like autumn leaves, I made my way back to the main house, my body protesting every step. The scene that greeted me in Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom was one of barely controlled chaos. Dr. Harrison bent over her pale form, his sleeves rolled up and his face grim. Master Whitmore paced by the windows, his usual commanding presence reduced to helpless anxiety. Mrs. Whitmore lay on her massive four-poster bed, her golden hair dark with sweat and her face twisted in agony. But it was the silence from the small bundle in Dr. Harrison's arms that told the real story. Her baby had been born, but something was terribly wrong. The child is alive but extremely weak, Dr. Harrison was explaining to Master Whitmore in low tones, premature, underweight, and having difficulty breathing. And Mrs. Whitmore has lost a great deal of blood. She's very weak. It was then that Mrs. Whitmore's eyes found mine across the room, and in them I saw something I had never expected to see. Desperation that matched my own vulnerability, that stripped away all pretense of superiority. Mara, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My baby, she can't. Dr. Harrison looked up at me with relief. Ah, Mara, good. The infant needs immediate nourishment, and Mrs. Whitmore is unable to nurse. You'll need to take over immediately. The irony hit me like a physical blow. Here was the woman who had starved me throughout my pregnancy, who had denied my child the nourishment they needed, now depending on me to save her own baby. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship was suddenly, completely reversed. I approached the bed slowly, my own body still recovering from childbirth, and looked down at the tiny infant Dr. Harrison placed in my arms. She was so small, so fragile, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin had a grayish tinge that spoke of distress, and her tiny fingers were almost transparent. Please, Mrs. Whitmore whispered, the words torn from her throat like physical things. Please save her. I'll do anything. Anything you ask. The woman who had never said please to me in 3 years of service was begging, her pride dissolved by maternal desperation. I looked from her pale, pleading face to the dying child in my arms, and felt the weight of a decision that would define us both. My baby, I said quietly. She need milk too. She just born, and she need her mama. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes widened as she understood what I was saying. In order to save her child, she would have to acknowledge mine. to accept that my daughter's needs were as important as her own child's survival. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course. Whatever she needs, please. Master Whitmore stepped forward, his face hard. Now see here, you can't be making demands at a time like this. But his wife raised a trembling hand to stop him. No, Charles, she said with more strength than she had shown all day. She's right. Her child has the same needs as ours. If we want our daughter to live, we must ensure hers survives as well. It was a moment of recognition, of one mother truly seeing another for the first time. The system of slavery that had divided us was still there, still powerful. But in that room, faced with the possibility of losing our children, we were simply two women united by the most primal fear and love known to humanity. The following weeks transformed the Whitmore plantation in ways that no one could have predicted, and certainly not in ways that challenged the very foundations upon which Southern society was built. What began as a desperate bargain between two mothers became something far more complex, a daily negotiation of power, survival, and unexpected understanding. Mrs. Whitmore's daughter, whom they named Elizabeth, clung to life by the thinnest of threads. She required feeding every 2 hours, and only my milk seemed to give her the strength she needed to grow. My own hope thrived at my breast, but the demands of nursing to infants left me exhausted and constantly hungry. True to her word, Mrs. Whitmore had ordered that my food portions be increased dramatically, not just the promised biscuit but full meals that included meat, vegetables, and fresh milk. The other house slaves watched in amazement as I was served portions that rivaled those of the white family. It was unprecedented, and it created ripples of confusion throughout the plantation's rigid hierarchy. Never seen nothing like it, Clara whispered to me one evening as we sat in my cabin, both babies sleeping peacefully in my arms. The way she looked at you now, like you a real person instead of just property. But it wasn't that simple, and we both knew it. Mrs. Whitmore's desperation had cracked the facade of superiority she wore like armor, but the underlying structure of our relationship remained unchanged. I was still enslaved, still owned by her husband, still subject to being sold or punished at their whim. The difference was that now my value had increased exponentially. The dynamic in the nursery had shifted in subtle but profound ways. Mrs. Whitmore spent hours watching me nurse both babies, her eyes following my movements with a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like envy. She had recovered physically from her difficult birth, but the emotional toll of nearly losing Elizabeth, of having to depend on me for her daughter's survival, had changed her. "Tell me about your daughter," she said one afternoon as I settled Elizabeth at my breast, while Hope slept in a basket nearby. It was the first time she had ever asked me a personal question, the first time she had acknowledged Hope as anything more than an inconvenience. "Her name is Hope," I replied carefully, unsure of how much honesty was safe. "She's strong, like her grandmama was." Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly, her pale hands folded in her lap. "Hope," she repeated. "That's a beautiful name. My grandmother's name was Hope." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. This small bridge of commonality between our worlds. "She slept through the night already," I continued, emboldened by her interest. "And she got a smile that light up the whole cabin when she happy. Elizabeth still wakes frequently," Mrs. Whitmore said softly. "The doctor says her lungs are still developing, that she may always be delicate." There was fear in her voice, the constant anxiety of a mother whose child hovers between life and death. As the days passed, I found myself in the strange position of counseling a white woman about motherhood, sharing the wisdom I had learned from Sarah and Betsy about caring for fragile infants. Mrs. Whitmore listened intently as I explained how to recognize signs of distress, how to comfort a colicky baby, how to encourage proper feeding. "You seem to know so much about children," she observed one day. "Have you cared for others before Thomas and Elizabeth?" The question opened a wound I had kept carefully closed. "I helped birth babies in the quarters," I said quietly. "Lost 3 of my own before Hope. They didn't. They couldn't survive on the rations we get." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. She understood what I wasn't saying directly, that her policies, her decisions about food and care, had contributed to the deaths of my children. The knowledge sat between us like a living thing, changing the air in the room. "I didn't know," she whispered finally. "You didn't ask," I replied, not unkindly but with honesty that cut deeper than anger. It was after this conversation that things began to change more noticeably. Mrs. Whitmore started asking about conditions in the slave quarters, about the health of the other women, about what was needed for basic comfort. Her questions were tentative, at first, as if she was learning a new language, but they became more specific and practical over time. She ordered improvements to the quarters, better food for nursing mothers, medical care for sick children. It wasn't freedom, wasn't justice, but it was acknowledgement of our humanity in ways that had never existed before. The other enslaved people watched these changes with cautious hope, afraid to believe they might last. "You working some kind of magic on that woman," Sarah said to me one evening, bouncing Hope on her knee while I rested. "Never seen a white mistress change like that. Ain't magic," I replied wearily. "Just two mothers scared of losing their babies. Fear make people see things different sometimes." But even as conditions improved, the fundamental injustice of our situation remained unchanged. I was still property, still subject to the whims of people who owned me. My daughter was still born into slavery, still destined for a life of servitude unless something dramatic changed in the world beyond the plantation. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I nourished two white children with my body, my own daughter would never have the opportunities or protections they would take for granted. Elizabeth would grow up to be a lady of leisure, educated and refined, while Hope would likely spend her life in service to Elizabeth's children. Yet in the quiet moments when I held both babies, feeling their small bodies relaxed and content against me, I allowed myself to imagine different possibilities. Maybe the world was changing. Maybe the tensions I heard whispered about in political conversations would lead to something better. Maybe my daughter would know freedoms I couldn't even imagine. Mrs. Whitmore had taken to joining me during the evening feedings, sitting quietly in the nursery as I nursed both children. One night, as autumn began to paint the leaves outside the tall windows, she spoke words I never expected to hear. "I want you to teach Elizabeth and Thomas to read," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "and Hope too, if you're willing." The suggestion was radical, dangerous even. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Georgia, punishable by severe penalties, but more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how she saw my daughter, as a person worthy of education rather than just another piece of property. "That against the law, ma'am," I said carefully. "Many things that are legal are wrong," she replied, "and many things that are illegal are right. I've learned that much in these past months." I looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and tried to imagine her growing up with the ability to read, to understand the world beyond what she could see and touch. It was a gift more precious than gold, more valuable than freedom itself in some ways. "Yes, ma'am," I whispered. "I'd be honored to learn them to read." And so began another chapter in our unlikely alliance. Two women from different worlds bound together by the most ancient of human experiences, the fierce love of mothers for their children. It wasn't equality, wasn't justice in any complete sense, but it was recognition, acknowledgement, and the beginning of hope for something better. The babies grew stronger under my care, both of them thriving as the seasons changed around us. Elizabeth's breathing improved, her color became healthy and pink, and she began to reach the milestones that had seemed impossible in those early desperate days. Hope developed into a bright, alert infant whose smile could light up any room she entered. As I write these words, both children sleeping peacefully nearby, I think about the strange turns life can take, how crisis can reveal both the worst and best in human nature. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was still the woman who had nearly starved me and my child. But she was also the woman who had ultimately chosen compassion over cruelty when faced with her own desperation. The system that enslaved us remained unchanged. The laws that made us property were still in force. But within the small world of the Whitmore nursery, something had shifted. Some recognition had been made, some acknowledgement of our shared humanity. It wasn't everything, wasn't nearly enough, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, in the darkness of slavery, a beginning was all the hope we had.